This is Duke University.
I've learned a lot from him, so you should definitely take advantage of his time here and learn as much as you can. It's a pleasure to talk to you about China and climate change today. I recently returned from, I was living in Beijing from 2004 till last year, working on environmental issues. I just returned to the States last summer. That was the third time I'd spent any length of time in China. The first time I went to China was in 1993, and then I later worked in China over a summer on energy efficiency issues in Beijing in 1999. So how many folks have been to China in the audience, by the way? Great, so a lot of people. And I think I just wanted to ask the audience to kind of think about sort of what has happened in China. You know, you've all been, a lot of you have been to China, you know a lot about China, but think about what has happened in China, sort of the transformation that's taken place from 1993 to today. When I first went to China in 1993, it was the year after Deng Xiaoping's famous Southern tour, when he kind of went south and really said, well, we're going to really kickstart economic growth and really accelerate economic growth. 1993 was the year that Walmart began to source out of China. So if you think about that, really, if you think about the percentage of things in this room that were probably produced in China, think about a lot of it starting around that time. And then the second time I traveled to China was around 2000. If people remember, that was about the time that China entered the WTO, and growth really accelerated quite a lot in the years after that. And if you've been to China, you've seen a lot of the economic activity that's really been the driver of a lot of the climate change challenges. So you've seen the construction cranes, all the buildings going up. So think about all the cement and the steel and the glass and all the energy that goes into that amount of growth. And you can see why the climate problem is a difficult one. When I was in China, my job was, what I tell people these days is that I was sort of a rule of law missionary. I was there to kind of promote not American style, but sort of rule of law and environmental rule of law. So my work was often with government, but also with NGOs and lawyers. It touched on traditional pollution, but it also touched on climate change, particularly in the area of how was China, from a governance angle, implementing climate change. So with that as background, I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about sort of what is happening in terms of climate change emissions in China, what China thinks about climate change, and what China is doing about climate change and why. So on those things, I'll talk for about 10 minutes and then look forward to the comments after in the discussion. So I think for those of you who have followed China, you know that there's been sort of two storylines that have emerged over the last 5-10 years. One is that of China as a country in an environmental crisis. But in recent years, another story has emerged, which is a story of China as sort of a green tech leader. So these two stories are obviously sort of contradictory. So what's going on here? So let's, hopefully by the end of my comments, you'll have a better sense of what's happening. A lot of people have sort of been confused by this sort of seeming paradox. So for a little bit of background, let's just frame exactly how serious the problem is. This is a general slide about kind of global greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see sort of greenhouse gas emissions increasing with the Industrial Revolution. Most of it in the early years coming from the US, from Europe, from the developed countries. But as you can see in the last 30 years, the piece from China and the developing world in general has really increased significantly. You can see the growth trends. in terms of the rankings, China has become the leading emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. This happened about 2006, 2007. And you can see this kind of top of the list, China, US, the EU as a group would be after that. And as a percentage matter, and keep in mind that this is changing so quickly that these 2008 numbers are already woefully outdated. But as of 2008, China was about 23%, US 18%, EU 14%. And a few countries made up kind of a few countries or a few blocks, and the EU as a bloc made up a significant percentage of the CO2 emissions in the world. Now, in terms of China specifically, the growth, as you can see from this slide, has been tremendous, particularly in the last 10 years. So to take a look at this chart, it's, steady growth, but really in the last 10 years. And a lot of that, about a third of that has been for manufacturing for export, but the rest of it has been for that kind of domestic growth, building the buildings, the transportation, the power to power a rapidly growing country. And the challenge is the energy mix in China, right? So China, the energy consumption is about 70%, a little over 70% coal. So China has a lot of coal. And overwhelmingly fossil fuels, right? You can see that of the non-fossil fuels, hydro and nuclear are the biggest, and renewables are still extremely small. This is, again, 2008 numbers. The numbers are a little bit bigger for the renewables, but still very small. So this reliance on coal has been a big problem. And before we get ahead of ourselves, we should also take a look at in the mirror and note that, of course, the U.S. energy mix is quite coal-intensive as well, if you compare the U.S. to other countries. But it's less so, maybe about 50% of energy is from coal. And the other issue is that into the future, the growth estimates are still, China is still planning to grow extremely rapidly. So this is just a slide, it's a little bit difficult to see, but these are different estimates of potential energy consumption growth to 2050. So as you can see, the energy growth demand will still grow quite a bit in the future. And then in terms of CO2 emissions, these are different estimates. So some of the more optimistic estimates predict that China can bend that curve so that even as energy grows, maybe the carbon emissions will decrease. But even in the most optimistic estimates, there's still quite a long period of growth ahead. And this is part of the overall trend of sort of developing countries really becoming the lion's share of the greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background of the kind of situation and what the future looks like. A few points I wanted to make that I made this morning in the climate change seminar are, as we think about this, there are also some sort of climate justice issues that often come up in the climate debate that are worth just noting. The two kind of justice issues that have been raised most frequently are China's per capita emissions and its historic emissions. So as a matter of per capita emissions, as of the time that China passed the US, China was equal in total emissions, but per person, only about a fifth. Now this is rapidly changing, but still China per person is much less than the US. And as a matter of cumulative emissions, also China, as of 2002, was only about 7% of cumulative emissions. So this is something the Chinese government and Chinese researchers raise a lot as a matter of justice. If there's a certain budget of carbon, if the developed countries have taken up most of it, why are we the ones being forced to bear the burden of reducing now? So these are just issues to keep in mind. And then the third issue that I want to just raise is just this issue of interconnectedness, how the U.S. and the developed world is quite interconnected with China. A lot of the things we use are produced in China. About a third of the emissions from China are produced for the things that we use. So those are just things to throw in the mix. I think that the growth trends in China make these justice questions a little bit less salient because China will, as a matter of historical emissions, equal the U.S. sometime in the next 10 or 20 years, and as a matter of per capita may hit U.S. levels as soon as 2017. Okay, so that's the background. And now, what does China think about climate change? Because as we know, in the U.S., there's quite a hot debate about the climate science, which I personally don't agree with the climate denial view, but it's a worthwhile question to ask: what do other countries think about this issue of climate science? So, China's official position has been very straightforward, that they believe that they will be harmed by climate change. That's worth noting. So they released a report, an official report before the Bali meeting, climate change negotiations meeting a few years ago, that said China will face a variety of harms because of climate change. I list them here. These, if you're familiar with climate change, the things, harms to agriculture, droughts, flooding, heat waves, disease, extreme weather events, and so forth. So this is what China believes, and they're already moving forward on adaptation because they believe that some of these effects will happen. So what are they doing about this problem then? So this is something that's received press, but it's worth noting exactly what China is doing about climate change. So the big change really happened about 5 years ago, in 2006, with China's 11th five-year plan. You may know that China operates these sort of Soviet-style kind of planned economies era five-year plans are still very important in China. And the 11th five-year plan began in 2006 and had probably the most important environmental and energy targets of any of the five-year plans before. And so the three main targets were a target to reduce energy intensity. So that's not the absolute amount of energy used, but the amount of energy used per unit of economic output, reduce that by 20%, basically increasing energy efficiency. And then two pollution reduction targets, reducing sulfur dioxide, which is largely pollution from coal-fired power plants and industry, by 10%. And then COD, chemical oxygen demand, is a measure of water pollution, reduce that by 10%. So these were very important targets, and what's not really been recognized outside of China is that they made a important shift in the way that they implemented these targets. These targets, who is responsible for meeting these targets? They're the leadership and the bureaucracy, right? So China is a unitary state, so that means governors, mayors, county heads, state-owned enterprise leaders. So think about the vast universe of people who have pieces of this target. And the significant change that was made in 2006 was that, in principle, the government said, well, previously environmental targets were low priority targets, but now we're going to make them hard targets and maybe even veto targets, which is the highest priority target, meaning that if you don't meet these, there will be career consequences, bonus consequences, and so forth. So that was an important shift. Before Copenhagen in 2009, China made some climate-specific announcements on carbon intensity and non-fossil fuels, and also forestation. And then also going into the future, the current 12th five-year plan, China is continuing with this model, setting targets. They've added targets, carbon intensity, non-fossil energy. They've also continued the energy intensity target. They've added pollution targets, and they've continued this model of setting targets for the bureaucracy and creating policies to implement it. So in terms of the drivers of this, it's worth just mentioning for a minute, and I apologize to the people in the class this morning. We discussed this in the class this morning. But the question is, why is China doing this? And as I mentioned this morning, authoritarian states are not known for their environmental protection. So why are they making environment a high priority? It turns out that there are very practical reasons and self-interested reasons that China is acting on this. The first few are economic in nature. China's sort of regime legitimacy is heavily based on its ability to deliver economic performance. And so shortage of energy has been a serious problem. Blackouts, brownouts, limits the need to import coal to go out to other countries to get energy. Those are all risks. China's also been worried that its economy has largely been based on low value-added kind of heavy industry. They're trying to transform it into higher value-added industries, and clean tech is part of that push. So the push into solar and wind is part of that push into higher value-added. And the other kind of, in addition to economic growth, the other top priority for China has always been social stability. So pollution has caused riots, discontent all around the country, and it's become a source of instability. 51,000 incidents of instability in 2005 related to environmental pollution. And so you can explain some of this action in terms of social stability. And then also just the kind of climate harms that I just talked about are a factor. And then international reputation is also a factor. China's taking a lot of heat, basically, for its impact on climate change, and that matters as China's taking a bigger role on the international stage. And ultimately, as I suggested, these all relate to sort of the government legitimacy, because as an authoritarian state, they are thinking about, well, how do we stay in power? How do we generate the performance and the factors that keep us in power? The only thing I'll add, I think because of time, I won't go into these specific policies they're implementing to meet these targets. But I will note that while I think it's very important that China has elevated these targets, the implementation challenges have been substantial. And I think they are the types of challenges that anybody faces when they are given hard targets and there are heavy consequences for not meeting those targets. And these are familiar, sort of a familiar principal agent problem. And in China, as in many of these types of principal agent problems, you see a lot of goal displacement, where local officials faced with these hard targets are doing things that don't necessarily meet the substantive aims of the targets, but technically meet the targets. So this is included in the last year or about a year and a half ago. A lot of probably the worst examples were local governments shutting down power to hospitals and street lamps in order to meet their energy efficiency targets. There are plenty of stories of factories not installing pollution reduction equipment, getting the credit for it, and then not turning it on. And there are a lot of other stories like this, and there's kind of challenges with transparency and trying to make it difficult to know what exactly is going on. So with that as background, I'll just stop there, and I'm happy to take questions or comments later. But I think overall, China faces a tremendous challenge. It's done some extremely interesting and never-before-seen things to try to meet this challenge, but the implementation problems are still substantial. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Jonathan, do you want to?
Thanks. Thanks, Alex, for a great overview. And I just want to add a couple of points from the perspective of addressing climate change as a global problem, a global public goods, in which it's essential to get international cooperation, but very difficult. There are incentives for each country to try to free ride or try to wait for other countries to move first. And that's really illustrated in very stark terms in the experience of the United States and China. So just to add to the daunting scale of the challenge that Alex already outlined, as he pointed out, that China's emissions of greenhouse gases have accelerated dramatically over the last 10 years. And to put that even in further perspective, back when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated in 1997, the forecast for when China would surpass the United States as the largest emitter of CO2 was about the year 2030. But by 10 years after that, by the year 2006, the International Energy Agency was forecasting that China would surpass the United States in greenhouse gas emissions in 2009. And then just a few months after issuing that report, the International Energy Agency said, wait, we were wrong, it's already happened. And So in 2006, China surpassed the United States as the largest greenhouse gas emitter. If one looks at cumulative emissions, Alex had a nice table of data there of cumulative CO2 emissions from 1850 to 2002, which showed that the United States accounted for about, I think it was 20 to 25% of cumulative CO2 emissions, which is some sense of how much the emissions had filled up the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gas emissions and drive temperature change. And China, on that period, 1850 to 2002, accounted for about 7% of cumulative CO2 emissions. But the International Energy Agency's forecast is that by 2030, that will be a tie. So in just 30 years, from 2000 to 2030, the rapid growth of China's emissions would catch up to the U.S.'s very large contribution to cumulative emissions. Another way to see that is from 1990 to 2010, U.S. emissions grew about 7%, whereas China's emissions grew over 200%. So that's a really daunting challenge, and some estimates of the ability of the world as a whole to achieve the target adopted in the Copenhagen climate change treaty meeting in 2009, the target of limiting temperature change to 2 degrees centigrade higher than the average global surface temperature just before the Industrial Revolution, so say 200 years ago. So to keep climate change below a 2-degree increase over the next century suggests that it's impossible without action in China. That is, even if the industrialized countries, the so-called Annex 1 countries in the Kyoto Protocol, all took drastic action to reduce their emissions, the emissions coming from non-Annex 1 countries, primarily China, but also others, would drive global temperatures above that 2-degree change. And there's a further issue, which is that the world economy is dynamic and interconnected. Part of the reason China's emissions have gone up so much has been because of dramatic economic growth. I mean, a major reason, economic growth in China, spurred by China's entry into the World Trade Organization, as Alex mentioned. That also means that there's a problem of leakage. Reductions by one country may just shift those emissions-intensive activities to other countries. So that underscores the need for international cooperation or collaboration. On the bright side, though, I think there have been several changes in China that speak to China's pragmatic, largely domestic, but also international relations interests in being more active on climate change policy, of which Alex mentioned several. I'll just highlight a couple of those. One is, I think the role of climate change scientists within China has been quite important and influential over the last 10 years. Up till about the year 2000, approximately, many scientists, or many Chinese government pronouncements on climate change spoke not only of the burdens to China of being asked to reduce emissions, but also of the benefits to China of global warming, that global warming would lengthen growing seasons, improve agriculture in northern China, and that was very consistent with studies coming from European experts like Richard Tall, who estimated that gradual global warming, in a paper published in 2001, that gradual global warming would be adverse for most parts of the world, but beneficial for northern Asia. And in Russia, the Soviet state climatologist in the 1980s, Mikhail Budiko, published a series of books saying that global warming would be good for Russia. It would expand agriculture in Siberia. But after 2000, that has changed, especially in China, with the role of scientists like Zhou Ji and Lin Erda, who contributed a series of reports, including to the Stern Review, pointing out that there could be sea level rise in prosperous coastal cities in China, flooding of Chinese rivers, droughts in northern China, and as some of those things, especially drought, have come to pass, that's become much more important and influential in China. Second factor is the perceived economic opportunity from shifting to a clean technology or renewable energy sector, especially for export, and of which much has been made, and we should talk about further. But a third factor is this point about social stability that Alex mentioned. And it's really fascinating to see that there's a long-term paleoclimate and archaeological history of drastic or abrupt climate change in China being associated with political upheaval and dynastic change. Professor David Zhang at University of Hong Kong has done a series of studies showing that sharp political break in the past in China has been associated with, or in time, and maybe precipitated causally by climate change, by droughts that led to unrest among the people. And it's very plausible that the current Chinese leadership is concerned about that kind of thing, and that even though the actual extreme weather events associated with climate change might not occur until some lag time, that the perception by the public of the government being insensitive to crisis events, to natural disasters in the short term, could still be a galvanizing or rallying pivot point for public upheaval. So it's plausible that the leadership in China, even if it ranks the environment as a low priority compared to economic growth, it ranks political stability as a very high priority, and so would be very concerned about these kinds of disaster or crisis events spurring riots or public outcry and upheaval. And so that's a further reason that that climate change and the extreme weather events associated with climate change might be of special importance. And in that light, it's noteworthy that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just issued a report on extreme weather associated with climate change this week. And that kind of evidence and forecasting, even though the forecasting is has a lot of uncertainties, is potentially influential to governments concerned about this kind of political stability. So those are, I think, are three important factors that may help explain the current and future concern and interest in serious climate change policy in China. And those offer opportunities for collaboration between the United States and China. Then the last thing I'll just say is probably the most important short-term factor is succession of leadership, elections in the United States, leadership change in China, both in the coming year. So it'll be very important to see how those play out in terms of U.S.-China relationships on climate change. I think when China announced its first quantitative target for reducing emissions in 2009, just before the Copenhagen meeting, the most important factor in that was the private conversation that occurred just before that between President Obama and President Hu. And so it'll be important to see how that kind of relationship or the successor leaders plays out in coming years. Thanks.
Don.
Thanks, Paul. These are mostly questions, really, more than remarks, but I'll try to keep them very short. And I don't know if Alex will have time to answer all of them, but of course, they're just things to think about. And the first question that occurs to me is the relationship between China's growth model and climate change. Because China's emissions and its growth model are closely tied together, and the current growth model calls for GDP growth through investment. As some of you may know, China's consumption share of GDP is a world historical low, and its investment share is really a world historical high, about 50% compared with about maybe 20% for most other countries. And at present, there's no sign of this trend reversing itself. And much of this investment that we see is in capital-intensive heavy industry and infrastructure projects, which I believe are major generators of greenhouse gases. For example, energy is subsidized and thus overused. Now, this growth model is really unsustainable in the sense that it will eventually collapse under the weight of the debt used to fund it. So I think relatively soon, China will have to move away from this growth model, either because the government plans to move or because a debt crisis forces them to. And the question is, what will be the effect of that on China's greenhouse gases emissions as investment declines and consumption increases in their relative shares of GDP, and as services make up a higher proportion of GDP? What will be the impact on greenhouse gas emissions? Is this a good thing or a bad thing from that standpoint? The second question really goes to the issue that Jonathan just raised, which is that of where the trade goes. If China's current output composition changes because of changes in its trading relations. I think also China's current model of high exports and a high current account surplus can't be sustained much longer, because especially during this economic crisis, China's trading partners aren't going to be willing to put up with the deficits that are required on their side in order for China to have a surplus on its side. And so how is that going to change the composition of China's industrial output? Is it going to happen because exports decline? And if China's exports decline, where are they going to go? Which country is going to be manufacturing the stuff that China used to manufacture and export? And what is going to be the effect on that, on greenhouse gas emissions? Or will it be done by increased imports? And if China balances its current account through increased imports, what industries in China is that going to displace? And what will the effect on greenhouse gas production be of that displacement? Alex mentioned the policy implementation model of China, and it's really impossible to overstress the importance of these targets that are given to officials. So legislatures passing law and government agencies kind of implementing the law is a relatively minor and unimportant way of getting things done in China. The real way you get things done is you set specific targets for officials to do things. And as Alex mentioned, that results sometimes in peculiar and inefficient responses. So, for example, in 2010, Alex also mentioned this idea of shutting down hospitals for electricity. Here's another interesting kind of anecdote, that starting the 5-year plan, the 11th 5-year plan came to an end in 2010, and in the city of Wenzhou, apparently, they were way behind on meeting their targets for electricity reduction, so they went to every enterprise which had a gross revenues of under 5 million RMB a year and said that for every day you produce, you will have to shut down and just turn your electricity off for between 2 to 4 days. So that's, as you can see, a very crude and really not very efficient method of saving on energy. And also it occurs to me that probably smaller enterprises are less intensive energy users than larger enterprises. For example, all services will tend to be in smaller enterprises rather than larger enterprises. So that may indeed have been counterproductive. Finally, I guess, on this issue of international cooperation, China has a particular governance model which is highly hierarchical, and there's very little communication between bureaucracies at the middle level. In other words, for one bureaucracy to communicate to another, they really have to go up to the top, and then the communication has to come down again. There's not much direct cross-communication. And that applies also to communication at the international level. And so, this is okay when you're having summit meetings, but it occurs to me that in an area like climate policy, which is so dependent on groups of experts getting together at relatively low levels of the bureaucracy and hammering out and fine-tuning policy at that level, it strikes me that the Chinese governance model is particularly ill-suited to policy making and implementation that way. And the question is this a crippling problem, or is there some way to minimize it?
Jonathan, I'm a little concerned that Jonathan Wiener opened up the possibility of discussing thousands of years of dynastic change historian, but...
I'll touch on it very briefly. One historical note, which is the story of Wenzhou. For those of you who remember China in the late 70s and early 80s. If you walk through a Chinese street, it would be completely dark because the idea was that they didn't accept the notion that as the bus gasoline engine turned, it was actually generating electricity. So that the lights were out on the buses to save their electric power. You'd take a train and you'd have a hard time persuading the people running the train that while the train was running, you could actually generate electricity and light the rooms on the train. But it also sort of underscores for me, coming back to Shanghai and talking about consumption, and unfortunately, in 1982, you couldn't take pictures of Chinese cities from airplanes without having your camera snatched. But flying over Shanghai in 1982 at about 10 o'clock at night on my way to Tokyo, you saw nothing. You had no sense that one of the great cities of the world was out there. And now to me, one of the kind of metrics of the changes, you can see the lights of Shanghai from about 300 miles offshore, just in terms of just gives you a sense of the social change and how much electricity is getting consumed. What I'd like to do is, just very briefly, is remind us to pick up on the theme of kind of outsourcing emissions. And just to remind ourselves that as China's search for solutions to its environmental problems, they're also searching for solutions to their energy problems. And this causes China to have a gigantic global carbon footprint. And I think when we talk about sort of climate change and China's activities, we need to be aware of what it's doing externally as well as it's doing internally. So as China searches for resources, you have to think about, well, what is the impact of China's activity in the tar sands of Canada, where China is a very heavy investor, is disrupting the environment, causing kind of significant environmental damage as they work with through tar sands. I'm not blaming the Chinese alone. I'm just saying the Chinese are active investors in this. In Africa, they have done clear cutting in Malawi in order to get to uranium mines, built roadways that previously had no penetration of the jungle, polluted rivers, and so forth. So that just as the old industrial countries in the 19th century didn't pay much attention to the environment in terms of their resource extraction in order to build their industrial economies, I think we also have to pay attention to China's outsourcing of the environmental consequences of its acquisition of resources. So you think about these gigantic tankers pulling up in Nigeria. What is the damage they're doing in Nigeria as they build wharves and docks? What is the carbon footprint created by these tankers as they move around? What is the carbon footprint of these huge, gigantic dump trucks collecting coal and uranium around the world? And so that this is both a kind of search for China's, it's an interesting kind of dual strategy I see globally. On the one hand, so much of China's push for energy independence and the development of solar, the development of wind power was explicitly an effort by the Chinese government to insulate itself against the power of the US Navy and the fear of its oil resources being cut off. On the other hand, China continues to be very active internationally in the acquisition of resources and thus having this quite significant impact. And this is kind of, then you see both the social stability that Alex talked about, but also the concern for international security as it affects China's policies toward various parts of the world, their interests in acquiring natural resources. So you have both the external stability, the internal social stability, the concern for energy security, how do we insulate ourselves from the military might of the US at the same time that we develop energy independence. One other question that I just wanted to raise that occurred to me listening to Don as he mentioned the example of Guangzhou, which is a city that's known a lot for its private enterprises, is there's been a lot of discussion in China about this notion of China solving their economic problems by the state advancing and the people retreating. And again, so one of the other questions that you want to think about is sort of as policy, what will be the mix of state-owned enterprises versus entrepreneurialism? And as entrepreneurialism expands, does the state lose its capacity to control or not? It uses a lot of bank lending to control what private enterprises do. Will environmental policies become part of this? There's just an announcement the other day that a bank is opening in China now kind of to do green lending for foreign investors. And then how does this affect as well kind of domestically? Finally, you got to track this every year. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was in China talking to the National Semiconductor Association, maybe longer ago, about 6 years ago, and they were obsessed in getting high-yield solar voltaic technology from the U.S. 18 months later, the U.S. companies that they wanted to acquire the technology from were now acquiring the high-yield technology from China. And so as we look at this, it's really a question of really keeping our fingers on the pulse to see the rapidity of change.
I think what I'd like to do is give Alex a chance to respond to the other panelists and then open things up to the group. We've certainly gotten a rich mix of ideas, including ideas related to the extraordinary speed with which things are happening and the difficulty predicting.
Great. I'll just say a few very brief things. I think, as to Jonathan's comments, I think if you have not read it, he had an article in the UCLA Law Review a few years ago about China and climate change, which I thought was excellent. I very much agree with his conclusions about the pragmatic needs for China to address climate change. And I think the point that you raised about the possibility of the connection between climate and the mandate of heaven, kind of historical connections between
I didn't bring it back.
natural disaster and regime change is really interesting. And then with respect to Don's comments, I think this growth model question is a really interesting one. You know, China is clearly in the middle of trying to transform its growth model from heavy industry towards more services. They've put a heavy push against sort of what they call in Chinese lianggao yizi, which is sort of high energy, high pollution, high sort of resource consuming industries. They're trying to stop those things. But the current verdict is that has not been done very, very well. But the interesting question you raised as well, if they actually do succeed in shifting to services, is that better? Because I think that connects then to the question of leakage. They're still going to be consuming things. Where are they getting those things? Has it just shifted to other countries? And then that connects to, I think, your remarks. And I think the tar sands point is an excellent one. The Africa point is clearly something we don't know enough about. I would recommend, if people haven't seen it, Evan Osnos, when he was with the Chicago Tribune, wrote an excellent series of 3 articles about China's impact, sort of U.S. consumer behavior's impact on China's environment and China's behavior as it impacts on the global environment. So he wrote a great story about lumber in Papua New Guinea. So there's some old growth forests in Papua New Guinea that hadn't been touched for centuries. And because China put a logging ban in China, they've needed to get wood elsewhere, and it's led to a big push into Papua New Guinea. And he also had a great article about the impact of $19 Walmart cashmere sweaters and desertification in China. So sort of the advent of the cheap cashmere sweater has led to intensive goat herding in Inner Mongolia and Mongolia, and that's led to desertification. So this theme of interconnectedness and thinking beyond just national borders, I think, is a really important one.
Ready to open this up to the questions from the audience, comments? Yes.
So you talked about China's concessions to the WTO and also the growth of the renewable sector. And as you know, we're seeing the intersection right now with the export credits, export taxes, the subsidies that are some of them do violate WTO, some of them will find out if they violate WTO, and some are being negotiated. The United Steel Workers claim about wind energy. I was curious if you could talk about your sense of where China's going with that. They're trying to push the envelope, see how far they can get, and pull back the subsidies, or you think it's stick in place to try to keep the renewable sector moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, kind of a very fluid issue right now. I can't really speak to the WTO rules, but in terms of the domestic factors that are driving these conflicts, the trend is clearly that China in the 12th Five-Year Plan, for example, has identified energy, these kind of clean tech industries and environmental protection industries as strategic emerging industries, which means that they'll provide subsidies, policy support, all sorts of support for those industries. And clearly they are trying to develop these these industries domestically into world-beating industries. And that kind of support is leading to these conflicts on the trade front. And so I think that the dynamic domestically seems to show no signs of ceasing. And the question is, well, how does it work itself out in under the trade rules?
Yes.
Well, as we all know, that China is the biggest solar panel manufacturing countries, and also 99% of those panels was exported, and there's no need for domestic needs. And also, China, as I read a paper that actually the whole country, the whole industry is losing money. I mean, the solar panel manufacturers. So, what do you guys think China's intentions for is like the massive subsidies for solar panels?
I couldn't hear the question.
So,
Repeat the question.
Yes, please.
yeah.
Well, I think what she was asking was, given that the solar panels are highly subsidized for losing money, what is the incentive for this
Yeah.
sort of push for green tech?
Is that just one corner of the market?
Because it doesn't correlate with the market.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so why is China doing it, I guess is the question, is it? Yeah, I mean, I guess the theory is that eventually, once China can basically creates a large industry and, these techniques will lead to creating a world-leading industry. And I think the anticipation is that we're gonna see an energy-constrained future that will need these technologies as well. And also, China, because of its kind of low-cost manufacturing structure, they believe they have a competitive advantage in these things, so they could see themselves dominating in these industries that they anticipate. I mean, they're already big money industries, but, they anticipate it being bigger in the future.
Let me just add, when I talked to the people in the National Semiconductor Association, they just said, we're gonna lose money on this for a long time. We see this as a national security initiative. This is, the State Council is telling us, this is one way we can reduce our energy independence on oil, and it's a national security need, so we'll eat the losses for as long as it takes.
And, companies do this, right? Like, investors complain that Amazon is not profitable enough. They've been investing, they're trying to build the market up.
Yeah.
Hi, my question is about sort of going back to outsourcing of emissions and international security. So as was noted, China is investing in nations kind of across the world to maintain its energy needs. So what potential implications does this have on the international commitment to sort of these climate goals, given that this is sort of a huge source of investment across the world now?
Professor Wiener.
Yes, he's the international.
I think you're touching on a very important issue, although I'm not sure what the "this" was in your sentence, in your question. But, so certainly the outsourcing, which is one characterization of international flows in trade and investment worldwide, is very important to climate change policy, because greenhouse gases mix globally in the atmosphere. And that essential scientific fact means that emissions anywhere on the planet have global impacts, and that reductions accomplished in one place have potentially have global benefits. So that means that both helps drive the free rider problem, that countries would have some incentive if emissions reduction is locally costly but globally beneficial, they have some incentive to let others bear the cost of achieving those globally shared benefits. It also drives the leakage problem, which is that if emissions are reduced in one place, but through the interconnected international trade and investment flows, those activities, those supplies of goods and services are outsourced. Their location is shifted in response to the regulatory constraint in one place, and the activities go on elsewhere, then the emissions continue to affect the global atmosphere. And actually leakage, this problem of relocating emissions called leakage, can be driven by actual dismantling and relocation, reconstruction of the very same physical facility, taking a steel plant from one country and moving it to another country. But it doesn't have to involve that. It can just be driven by changes in relative prices. So the United States consumes less fossil fuels. That lowers the world price for fossil fuels and increases the quantity demanded elsewhere. Or the flip side for forests. If we restrict supply of timber, that increases the world price in timber markets, and that may increase the quantity supplied elsewhere. And furthermore, the leakage can range from very low percentages, that is, there might be some reductions in emissions that don't cause much leakage or outsourcing, to even potentially greater than 100%. And the way that could happen is if the economic activity relocates to a place where the emissions associated with it are greater than the emissions were associated with the original activity. So for example, moving the steel manufacturing plant from Germany to China might be associated with, or from a country that relies on a mix of fuels that includes some nuclear as well as some fossil fuels, to a place where it's heavily coal fired electricity, that could result in more than 100% leakage. And there have been some, not just anecdotes, but some macroeconomic modelings, for example, at the MIT integrated assessment model, which suggested plausible scenarios of more than 100% leakage under some partial constraints. So all of that, both the free rider problem and the leakage problem, highlight the need for international cooperation to address, if we're going to address climate change through reducing emissions.
Paul, can I answer?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question of Don and Alex, which is in terms of policy implementation, so that the National Development and Reform Commission in China, which is running much of this green policy and has a low carbon economy. And so I wondered, given your experience in working with them, what you thought of Don's, whether these guys have the capacity to do the kind of integrative policy implementation that Don identified as one of the problems in China.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, over the last 3 years, the kind of phrase "low carbon economy" has become kind of a buzz phrase in society. So, it's kind of penetrated society because grandmothers know the phrase "low carbon" in China these days. So, but what it really means on the ground is really difficult to tell right now. I mean, initially it felt like, well, this is just a slogan. There's a lot of PR about it. But now there's certainly a lot of money being thrown after it. But as to let's take, for example, the concept of smart growth, the idea of organizing a city in a way that's more low carbon. Very difficult to do. Very difficult to do in the States. I mean, not that many successful stories here. And so I think that fragmentation and the lack of horizontal communication that Don talks about is really going to be a challenge. So what you've seen so far is that largely the actions taken have been investment oriented. So the local governments are great at getting money and investing in things. So they've invested in greener technologies, which is a good thing. But beyond that, the things that require coordination, there's been no signs that these traditional problems will be resolved.
Yeah, I would just add that in addition to the well-known problem of the center trying to get the local governments to go along with what they want, there's also, I think, a sometimes underestimated problem of central policy making itself. China is no longer in the era where we have a single strong leader who can, say something and then make it happen. And certainly the NDRC is not a body that can just say something and make it happen. There are, loads of vested interests in China. Families that are prominent in certain industries. One thinks of the Li Peng family, for example, which dominates the energy sector. And, it's very hard for the NDRC. I mean, there's one example, right? The energy sector, pretty important sector to be able to regulate effectively if you're interested in regulating greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, when you think about, the current political crisis going on in China, there's a lot of horse trading, and one suspects that in this kind of horse trading, it's going to be very hard for people who need the support of these different sectors, of these different people who control different aspects of the state-owned economy. It's going to be difficult to get them to go along with things that damage their economic interests when you need their support, for political reasons.
Yes.
Two questions. The problems China is facing are really complicated and related, including but not limited to the degree of rule of law, the political system, bureaucracy, the awareness of the people. So even if we want to tackle the environmental problem, other people may say, well, if you really want to do this, you have to solve this and that problem first. So from the perspective of an outsider, what do you think would be the key first step that China should take to solve the environmental problem? And the second question is that it seems to me that all the difficult problems of China boils down to one problem, which is the degree of rule of law. But unfortunately, as far as I can see, hardly any Chinese law firm, including those top firms, have the environmental department. So, what do you think the lawyers can do to help to solve the environmental problem? What's the lawyer's role in that situation?
I think I heard two questions. The first sounds like it's for Professor Wiener about how you organize political bodies to deal with climate change, and maybe the second is for Professors Clarke and Wang on the operation of law in China.
Okay, well, actually, your question prompted me to think about this, that in China, as in the United States and other countries, there's often a trade-off, real or perceived, between environmental protection and economic growth, and especially in China, emphasizing economic growth and emphasizing economic growth for social stability as well. That's a potentially difficult trade-off. And so one way to try to reconcile those two is to design better environmental policy instruments that are less costly while achieving significant environmental protection. In the United States, that's been in part handled through the development of market-based or economic incentive-based environmental instruments like emissions trading or cap-and-trade systems, which in the US for acid rain proved to be hugely successful environmentally and at extremely low cost. So in China, fascinatingly, one of the things that's going on, at the same time that China's been growing economically so rapidly, it's also been developing a much greater culture of markets as a way to achieve social goals. And one of the things that's been going on is that some of the same experts who helped design the US cap and trade system for acid rain, for SO2, have been working in China to develop cap and trade systems for urban and regional air pollution problems in China. So Dan Dudek from the Environmental Defense Fund, for example, has been at work for 10, 15 years in China on developing these kinds of policies with Chinese experts. When I was in Beijing 2 years ago, I met with colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Sciences who have a project on interprovincial emissions trading. And I think that kind of experimentation and innovation of environmental policy instruments can have a very important long-term payoff for climate change as well as for conventional air pollution. It does, however, emphasize the need for accurate monitoring. And so issues of data collection, transparency, a number of the kind of operational implementation and enforcement and public awareness issues are crucially important for policy instruments like cap and trade. And that maybe goes to your second question of what Alex Wang may want to address.
Sure, I think those were really great questions. I think in terms of one of when I was working in China on these issues, I thought that the issue that could get the most immediate traction was the transparency issue. I think that is at the root of a lot of accountability issues, because fundamentally, big issues, well, how are the regulated entities accountable to the law? If you don't even have the information to tell whether they're violating the law, that's a fundamental kind of prerequisite. And I think there's been progress on that, both on the legal level and on the implementation level. So I think, if you were going to work on something, I would suggest pushing on that. And then in terms of what can lawyers do on this, I think that, you're right that there aren't, at least in the corporate firm sector, there aren't a lot of environmental practices in China. There's not a lot of money to be made on this yet. But I think, that's not across the board. There are firms that are setting up practices, starting to advise on this. Particularly some of the multinationals have Chinese lawyers and foreign lawyers, like General Electric, for example, has a fairly large legal office that actually has some experts on environmental law. And so I think you're starting to see certain companies, certain parts of the market recognizing that, well, they're, particularly the multinationals or the bigger companies are viewed as more able to comply with the law, so they'll get more enforcement pressure and they'll actually need more legal advice.
If I can just add a few words, so what can lawyers do? Again, as Alex said, the reason that the big firms or the small firms don't have environmental practices is because, it doesn't pay, because lawyers are in the business to make money, basically, and that's okay. And so the question is, what could lawyers do to make this pay? And I think one answer is to, maybe in the sense of, to the extent they can lobby and get anything, is to lobby for an alternative form of enforcement of environmental law, which involves more bottom-up enforcement. That is, sort of a private attorney general approach to environmental law enforcement. Now, so far, that is pretty much, anathema to the Chinese government, because the idea of, private citizens being able to kind of go around without any kind of state control and activate the machinery of the state just because they feel like it, that's not really a nice concept if you're a Chinese official. But I think China will gradually come to, there are signs already that the government is willing to accept that within limits in certain areas, for example, consumer protection. And so I think we may gradually come to see this approach more widely used in environmental law. As Jonathan said, monitoring is key, and you cannot have a government, there aren't enough government officials in China. There's a lot, but there still aren't enough to stand at the end of every pipe end, and to watch what's coming out. But there are, in a sense, enough citizens to be able to monitor almost every pipe end in China if they have an incentive to go out and do so. So there's, and then there is a opportunity for lawyers to work in that area then.
Take one more question. Serge?
So I wanted to ask about the cost of implementation of pollution reduction measures. There's no doubt that pollution has a strong effect on China's environment. The comment was made that you couldn't see Shanghai due to the lights. And my own experience when I was flying in last summer was that I couldn't see Shanghai due to the thick layer of smog that was hanging over the city. It seems like we're essentially forcing our own, wealthy country mentality onto China, even though they're the second, richest country in the world, or second largest economy. Their GDP per capita is still incredibly small, and as a percentage of that GDP per capita, the solutions to their environmental problems seem to be prohibitive at this point. So how do you solve that problem without magically increasing the wealth of everyone in China? And what do we do until GDP per capita becomes so large as to have everyday citizens care more about the environment?
Yeah, I think that one thing we need to parse out is embedded in your question is this notion that doing environmental protection is only more costly, right? So I think that's not necessarily always the case. And so, one way that China is approaching this is, for example, a lot of the pollution is coming from smaller facilities, inefficient facilities that have old equipment. One thing that's very different in China than in the States is that there's massive turnover and new construction. So there's much less hesitation about shutting down a lot of these smaller plants, and that's explicitly in the targets that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of the new plants being built are actually, for example, if you take the coal-fired power plants, are being built with some of the more advanced technology. And so, I mean, one way they're dealing with this is that they're actually eliminating a lot of the most inefficient producers and are actually, well, making it as a condition of new construction to basically invest in better equipment. So in terms of there are ways to deal with the costs. I mean, there's state subsidies, and particularly with the state-owned enterprises, they have access to credit and so forth, and so they're able to foot that bill. And so I think it's very much possible to do it now. And I mean, another aspect of your question as well is China not sort of developed enough to do this, and are we expecting too much of them? I think that you'll hear that argument in China, but I think among at least the central decision makers, there aren't that many people making that argument. Now, people recognize that the situation is so bad that they need to get a handle on it, and that regardless of the per capita income, something needs to be done, and they're taking these approaches that we discussed.
We have one last comment from Professor.
Oh, go.
I'll split it with you.
Okay, very quickly, you're assuming that the people in the Chinese communities don't want to make the sacrifice for the sake of the environment. And I would argue, coming back to Don's point about private enforcement, that, for instance, if you look at the ecological tourisms in Anhui, some of those covenants that have controlled development date back several hundred years, where the community said, we have a particular place here, in order for it to be sustainable, we will give up economic benefit for the sake of the environment, which has an immeasurable economic benefit. But again, the problem comes back to Don's point, is the state doesn't necessarily want to let people roaming around enforcing these things themselves or creating legally binding covenants without running it through the authorities.
So on the point about not being able to see Shanghai, that's also not necessarily a brand new problem. When I was in Shanghai in 1987, there were no skyscrapers, there was much less heavy industry, but it was also impossible to see across the city because of the cloud of dust. One thing that's changed significantly is not only the industry and skyscrapers and economic development, but also monitoring, including of fine particulate air pollution. And you may recall the episode from last year in which the U.S. Embassy had fine particulate monitoring on its roof, and that raised a lot of awareness among the Chinese public about those kinds of issues. So I think the macro answer, global answer to your question is, if the world waits for China and India and other countries to follow a development path similar to those followed by the United States and Europe to get to a per capita income that's approximately equal, it'll be too late to solve the climate change problem, at least by reducing emissions. We'll be left with geoengineering as the way to solve climate change problem. So the way to solve the climate change problem through emissions abatement in the nearer term is to find ways to make it attractive, not burdensome, to rapidly developing countries through, for example, an international cap and trade system that provides a market in private financing for the kind of technological turnover that Alex was describing. So that's the kind of policy design I've been trying to work on, and I think could still be quite promising.
And I think, before I thank the panel, progress is possible. When my older son first moved to Shenyang, the mayor was put on a big announcement in which he proudly announced that Shenyang had formerly been the most polluted city in the world and was now only 13th. So, progress is possible. But with that, I'd like to thank the panel and thank you, Alex.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.